Well, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel McCrickard. I am an LMFT, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Motivo. Just want to give big thanks to AAMFT for helping us with this event today. They reached out and said, what topic might be interesting to our members? And this is the one that we chose. And we have a great panelist of people who are going to be talking to us about systemic supervision today. So we're excited to get into it. Let me just briefly introduce you to Motivo in case you're unfamiliar with it. Motivo is a platform that I created in 2017. It's a HIPAA compliant video clinical supervision platform. So it connects new therapists who have recently graduated with a clinical supervisor in their same state and allows them to get supervision hours online towards licensure, which is now allowed in almost every state for some or all of your hours. We have a full directory of the different rules regarding telesupervision. We can send that out if you're unsure of what the rules are in your state and for your license type. But that's who we are and what we do. And it was really born out of my own experience of being a rural LMFT in North Georgia and driving 2 hours to get to the closest clinical supervisor in Atlanta for a couple of years and paying a lot of money to get my clinical supervision hours. So created Motivo to be an easier solution for that. And all of our panelists today are supervisors that you will find on Motivo. They're all listed there. They're incredible supervisors. And I picked them with intention because they all have a different modality that they practice in. And I really wanted to make the topic of today's discussion around this idea of systemic supervision. And we'll get into exactly what I mean by that. But let me just briefly share that I went to school in California, in Southern California, at an MFT program. I graduated, and my first job out of college was working in Skid Row with chronically homeless adults. And the only supervisor that was available at the agency was an LCSW. She was great, but she didn't count for the hours that I needed to become an LMFT in Georgia, which is where I knew I was moving back home to where I'm from. So supervision was difficult for me, even when I was out there right out of grad school, but particularly finding supervision that was in line with all of the education that I just had. I went from learning about Bowen and Satir and structural and strategic and things that I don't really think much about anymore today. But like really incorporating that into my clinical practice is not something that I was able to do once I started seeing clients because I didn't have a supervisor who really understood that modality. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Again, we have 5 incredible panelists who are going to take us through this discussion. So I'm going to start with Dr. Farrell and just ask each of you to go around and introduce yourself. And if you could just start by sharing what modality you practice with and just anything about your practice that you might want to share with the attendees today. So Dr. Farrell, I'll let you start.
Yes. Thank you so much. Really excited to be a part of this panel. Like she said, my name is Dr. Jasmine Farrell. I'm currently a assistant professor at Virginia Tech. I'm teaching their master's and their doctoral program. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and a police supervisor and supervisor mentor. And I have a group practice that's exclusively online. And so that kind of fits in with Motivo, taking advantage of the teletherapy, telesupervision platform, which I really appreciate, and making things more accessible. So in terms of my clinical practice, I was originally trained in integrative problem-centered meta frameworks. They've sifted it up, and now it's fancy, and it's integrative systemic therapies. And essentially it's just a meta model, that explains how to conceptualize the client's presenting problem and how to navigate through the different, family systems models. And so within that framework, I tend to fall with solution focus, a little CBT and a little EFT with my couples as well, but always through a socioculturally attuned lens, taking the contextual and diversity factors into account. And so that is my practice and professional identity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks for being here. And I didn't know you were at Virginia Tech. My husband's a huge UVA fan. So
There you go.
yes, huge into it. So thank you so much for being here. And I see a lot of people raising their hands too, which is awesome. If you want to put any questions that you have for the panelists at any time into the Q&A, we're definitely going to leave time for you to ask some questions. But mostly what we pulled from were the questions that were entered when people registered, which was great. So please put your questions in the Q&A and I'll definitely take a look at those. So Catherine, how about you next? Can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your practice?
Hi, I'm Catherine Futner, a licensed marriage and family therapist out of Massachusetts and Hawaii, and a certified substance abuse counselor out of Hawaii. I am currently working with service members and their families on a military base locally. I also have a private practice, and I do like independent contracting work for Couples Therapy Inc., which is a national and international couples therapy practice. When it comes to like what's my modality, what are my approaches, a lot of the parenting work I do comes from like the applied behavioral analysis perspective. In terms of the couples work, which is really what I absolutely love doing and really appreciate focusing my time and energy on. I'm a trained emotionally focused couples therapist. I'm trained through levels 3 of Gottman Method couples therapy. I'm currently taking developmental couples therapy level 1. I'm a certified discernment counselor and a certified neurodiverse couples therapist. So just really taking that systemic approach and seeing how these different modalities integrate that into their different functions.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. And how about you, Dr. Addison?
Hi, I'm Dr. Sheila Addison, and I'm core faculty at Antioch University, Seattle, which is where I'm coming from today on unceded tribal lands of the Duwamish people. And I have been an AMFT approved supervisor for a little over 15 years now. I was trained at Syracuse University in a broad spectrum of family therapy approaches, but particularly focusing on self of the therapist and social justice, which are two lenses that I still continually use in my clinical work and my supervision. I am hopefully very much at the end of the Gottman certification process. I'm also working toward being an ASECT certified sex therapist in that process. So when I supervise, though, I have supervised in a really wide variety of settings, and I've supervised folks working in a wide variety of settings. And so I tend to take a sort of, somewhere between eclectic and integrative approach. I am often encouraging folks to go back to some of their basics, even just basic systemic concepts, using Bowen and differentiation, or using structural if they're working with kids. But I also have a very humanistic and collaborative approach as well. And although I encourage my supervisors seeing couples to learn about and to think about Gottman concepts, I also work with folks doing a lot of EFT, using mindfulness approaches, etc. So very broad spectrum of stuff that and I'm sort of you bring to me what you want to learn more about, and we'll learn more about that together. I even have started incorporating more solution-focused approaches, which my younger grad school self would have found horrifying, because I've learned how that can be useful as well. So, yeah, I think that's the lens of self of the therapist and social justice, anti-racism, feminism is always kind of top of mind for me.
You also, Dr. Addison, lead one of the special interest groups for AAMFT. Do you still?
Oh, I am part of the leadership team. I'm actually secretary, but part of the leadership team for the Queer and Trans Advocacy Network, which is one of the topical interest networks of AAMFT, yes.
Excellent, good. And then Dr. Oliver, how about you?
Hi, everybody. Hi, Brandy. I saw your message in the chat. I am an associate director for MFT clinical training at North Central University. I'm also a professor there, and I have a private practice in South Florida. I'm an AMFT approved supervisor as well as a mentor, and I primarily am influenced by solution-focused brief therapy as well as narrative therapy, but everything comes through a Bowen informed. It's Bowen informed because I like to look at families and look at history, look at patterns within the system, and apply those ideas related to solution focused brief therapy and narrative therapy when looking at the family system. So that's a brief summary of me.
I love it. And you've got so many of your students in here as well, which is great. Please feel free to say anything you want, well, not anything you want in the chat, but introduce yourself in the chat or say anything to our panelists, because those will be recorded later and they can look through them. So even if they can't respond live, feel free to drop them a message if they say something that you want to, you know, comment on or agree with. All right, Dr. Ball, how about you?
Thanks, Rachel. I'm Dr. Derek Ball. I am an AMFT approved supervisor as well, an LMFT in Illinois. I'm in Rock Island, Illinois. I work at a United Way agency. So we've got a sliding fee scale. We see a lot of people here in our Quad City area along the Mississippi River trying to get unfrozen at this time. But for myself, in terms of how I approach therapy and sometimes supervision, I really like the narrative approach. I have a background personally in theater, musical theater in particular, and I've always been fascinated by story and really expression of that story. And so I'm curious about not only individuals and how they view their stories, but also applying that to the couple, you know, thinking about a couple and the narrative they write about their relationship. So that's really the theory throughout grad school, and then my practice beyond that that's continued to fascinate me throughout the years.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Ball. This is great. So we're going to dive into the topic a little bit more intentionally. I have 6 questions. I always like to know what's ahead of me. So we have 6 questions. We're going to go through those questions. We're going to talk about what is systemic supervision. We're going to talk about how to find a good supervisor who might be systemically focused, what to look for, what to do when your work environment doesn't have a systemic supervision approach, and how you can look for that a little bit more, or ask for it of your supervisor, and then some real practical tools for our supervisors who are on the call of how to incorporate more systemic approach in what you do. So let's dive into it. And I'm Catherine, I'd like to start with you to just help define for us, what do we even mean by systemic supervision? Like, what is it and what is it not?
Yeah, and I see that there are a ton of LMFTs on here, so my apologies if some of this is already sort of aware of knowledge. At the same time, I think it's helpful to really break down what is meant by this descriptor of systemic. And a systems perspective really just takes into account the whole rather than the sum of its parts. So the focus shifts from an individual level and says that this individual operates within context, or what we might call systems. And the interactions, the dynamics, the organization, functions, and the rules of that system impact the outcomes that we see in that person. So if you imagine a machine, there are different parts that work together to provide a certain output. And if one of these parts changes, it reverberates or ripples back into the rest of the system and can change how the whole machine shows up. So if I have a car and I'm not really paying attention to my brake pads and they start wearing down, it's going to eventually impact the function of the parts directly connected to it, and then into the larger operation of the braking system, and then into the car. So we sort of take that and say, who's the person sitting in front of us, and sort of applying that perspective to them. Moving into the supervisory aspect, there are different models of supervision. I incorporate developmental and systemic approaches as the foundation for my supervision. A systemic supervision lens is an exploration of the self of the therapist and the reciprocal influences between the multiple systems, including the personal system of the therapist, the professional system, the therapist-client system, as well as the supervisor-supervisee system. So I'm not only hearing what the supervisee is telling me, I'm evaluating how these different systems may be interacting, influencing the supervisee, and creating the questions that I'm asking to help the supervisee shift into evaluation of these systems as well.
That was so well said and so much more fluid than I could have done. So thank you for that. Dr. Oliver, I'd love for you to respond to that same question, because I know you work, in the school setting. You might be helping some of your students think about systemic approaches. How would you define systemic supervision?
My approach to systemic supervision involves my interns or students looking at the system. how are you looking at the system? What do we need to take into consideration? Who are we not thinking about when we are talking about the problem? I really want students and interns to really consider how they are also part of the system when they are having these conversations, because they are also going to be impacting the system. They might not be the brake pads, as Catherine was talking about, but they are part of the system. Um, when I think about how my supervision looked at when I was in a primarily independent of they not independent, but they looked at individuals more than they looked at the system. It was significantly different than when I worked with my supervisor, who really encouraged me to look at things systemically and actually helped me with the Bowen approach, because I was able to, again, take in the family, take in those who are not part of the family, but still have some influence. So my systemic supervision really encourages interns to take everybody and everything into consideration, and also those that we're not really aware of.
Mhm. That affects us as well. Yeah, well said. Dr. Farrell, I'm going to ask you the next question, which is really from the angle of a supervisor. Say you're a supervisor and you have supervision that you do for your workplace, and you have some MFTs, but you also have social workers and professional counselors and people who might not have come from the systemic perspective, and you're supervising all of them. How can you, as a systemic supervisor, bring a little bit more of that approach into your supervision?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it starts with providing that education about what system theory is, what systems perspective looks like, and giving the supervisees the tools and the language to even begin to have those conversations, right? So providing like a platform or foundation of information. And something that I do, in my own supervision is make sure that the structure of supervision is reflective of that, right? Like, for example, something as simple as having my supervisees give me the contextual factors of their case before they, jump into, hey, this is what's going on. It's like, okay, great. But let's tell me about their race, their gender, their SES, who are they living with, so just kind of priming them in that regard to begin, presenting their cases that way, and then prime them to think about all these different pieces of their lives that are also impacting what's going on with them. And also bringing in the self-love therapist and self-love supervisor, because Dr. Putner said it so great, and as Dr. Oliver as well, it's about the client system, but also making sure we make space in supervision to talk about the supervisory system, right? So all the things that I am and my identities and the clients and the things that we, our experiences have influence on the process that's going on in supervision, also in turn with the client. And finally, facilitating the conversation between the supervisees is something that is really important for me, because we have such unique backgrounds, that kind of, some may be more attuned to race, or some may be more attuned to biology, or, whatever different parts of the system, and kind of helping us check our own blind spots by having that conversation be the foundation of supervision.
Yeah, that's can be quite powerful, I think, in group supervision. And you talking to makes me think about one of my supervisors who I can remember, as I was telling her about a case, she would write a genogram, like she'd be drawing out the genogram as I'm talking about them, as a way to bring in that systemic approach. I love that. And then Dr. Ball, same question for you. How would you respond to what you could encourage supervisors to do in a workplace that might not be strictly systemic or MFT focused?
Well, one thing that I thought of when you asked that question is, I think Dr. Farrell did a nice job of talking about, setting up supervision, and I completely agree with that. And I think the other thing that I can do as a systemic supervisor is also try to help the therapist that I'm supervising structure the way they're doing therapy to make it systemic. And so one of the things that we work with our interns, the folks we supervise here, are some of the practical skills that especially people who aren't coming from a family systems background might not think about. So thinking about how, if you've got an individual, they're coming in and talking about a marital issue, the spouse isn't there, the partner isn't there, right? How do you, as a therapist, teach that person how to recruit their partner to come in the next time? right? Some of those even, I don't know, they feel a little concrete skills, but if you haven't been thinking systemically, you don't think about how important it is to have everybody there, or how to teach parents or structure the session with parents to say, I don't want to just see, you know, the IP kid. I want all their siblings. How can we bring everybody into the room? And if I'm asking that question as a supervisor, I'm helping my therapist that I'm supervising to begin thinking right from the get-go of how do we get the whole system to be a part of therapy. So I think that's a really tangible kind of skill that's important. If you're going to do systemic work, you have to have the whole system there as much as you can.
That's right. Yes, I love that. How about you, Dr. Addison? What would you say?
Well, I mean, I think that Dr. Farrell and Dr. Ball really, you know, set this up very well, because what I do follows along very closely with what they both spoke about. You know, I think one piece I'll just talk about here more specifically has to do with this assessment piece, because as Dr. Farrell said, when people start kind of jumping into a formulation of the case or a diagnosis or a report about a kiddo in school or a client that they're receiving in an agency, and I stop them and say, tell me about who this person lives with. Tell me about that person's home life. What do you know about how mom was raised? What do you know about how stepmom was raised? What do you know about the family in terms of ethnicity, race, spiritual or religious practice? Oh, someone in the family is an immigrant. Are they documented or no? Do you know that? And then when the supervisee often will start to say, well, I don't know a lot of these things, I'll ask them, so I want you to think about why you don't know these things and why you know the things that you do know. How did we come to have this story? I mean, essentially in a kind of narrative or a postmodern way, how did we come to have this story about the client, this description, but not this description? So now I want you to go back and to think about how you might draw out some more of this information. I do use what I think of as the quick and dirty genogram, which I tell my supervisees I have on top of every case file for every client, individual, couple, family, or otherwise, because it helps keep me oriented sort of in space and time in the client's world. And so I've taught a lot of folks to do their own, you know, quick and dirty genogram. And forget the genogram software, forget memorizing all the symbols, draw a map that shows you who is in the picture here. And then as Dr. Ball is saying, as we start to go forward, that may also give us hints about actually which is the most effective unit of treatment here. Sometimes my folks are working at places where they don't have a lot of choice. I actually have worked and supervised for 13 years in the Bay Area, although I'm in Seattle now and all of my work is still in Northern California. And in the Bay Area, there's a tendency for a lot of students to do a great many of their hours in school placements, which only function during the school day, which don't ever provide the opportunity to bring in parents, even for fairly small kids, and where there seems to be even a kind of allergy to bringing in even sibling systems, for example, or for older youth, bringing in intimate partners or bringing in parents. And so I have to, often ask them, how could you gather this information? And even if you only have this one person in front of you, then what kinds of, sort of in a Bowenian kind of way, how could you be trying to kind of feed back some change into the system so that you're not just targeting this one person? Let's teach you to do something new. Let's teach you some coping skills or some behaviors that then the homeostasis of the bigger system is going to try and change back. And so once we move from the assessment to the intervention, trying to think about what impacts might we have, or what change back mechanisms might we receive from the system if we just work at this level. So when we start with that systemic assessment and we figure out what we don't know and how we're going to go and fill in those parts of the picture, and that helps us to look at a person not just in isolation, but in terms of how they are, engaged in an intergenerational, sort of relational sets of roles and feedback loops with other people, and then what is helping keep this problem stuck, not just what's inside that person. So then that shapes our thinking about treatment down the line.
Love it. Yeah. You know what that discussion is making me think of too is like that work that I did early on in my career in Skid Row. I was only ever seeing individuals, chronically homeless individuals. Their families had not been engaged with the individual that I was seeing for many, many years. But there was still an opportunity, I think, to do systemic work with those individuals because they had they had the memories, they had the relationships, they had the cutoff, histories, lots of that kind of stuff, and you can still do systemic work with even one individual. And so, I'd like to kind of talk about the other side of that as a supervisee, and I'm thinking of even very tangible limitations to this. I worked in community-based health for a number of years. I'm sure many people on the webinar today have, and there's just even some billing restrictions or some billing, lack of capability around doing family therapy with Medicaid clients that sometimes disproportionately tend themselves towards individual supervision. So I'm thinking about like that individual who's working in a community-based setting who might not have access to systemic supervision. How can they do more systemic work? So let's start with Dr. Oliver. Could you respond to that one?
One of the things that I encourage students to do is one, reach out to people that they are already have in their systems, whether it's their faculty, whether it's their classmates, find out who they know that knows a model or skill that they are really interested in. A lot of the time students and interns are prepared to, or they at least are aware that they might have to pay for supervision. And if that's something that's really important to you, Gottman training, being Bowen informed, any of these types of things are important for you to consider whether or not you're willing to pay for that. A lot of people have invested time, and it might be a good investment if it's something that you want to move forward with as well. I really like the training that I got related to Bowen from actually my faculty member at Nova Southeastern University. And I feel that it was time invested in me, and it has really informed everything that I do as a clinician today. So if you don't have those relationships, start with who you already know in your system and who they might know. We almost all know somebody who knows somebody. So it's helpful to start there. And then if you don't find something there, search online, look up, specific skill or modality that you're interested in, type in your area that you're located in, and then see what comes up from there and have a conversation with that person, see if it might be a good fit. And then again, consider whether or not it's going to be beneficial for your future plans and your goals as a clinician once you become fully licensed.
That sounds like you said that to a few students over the years, I bet. That's
just a couple of times.
How about you, Catherine? How would you respond to that question?
Yeah, so I think that, when we look at what's the culture of a site or what's the culture of, a supervision practice, we have to remember people are the ones who create those cultures, right? Like the people in that system will be the ones who really set up, are we more CBT focused? Are we more case management focused? Are we more like diagnosing the individual focused, right? Like what's really sort of the focus that you're going to see in those different sites? I know when I was looking for my internship practicum site, I got some really great feedback that there was this one LMFT at this one substance abuse treatment facility in Hawaii, and like she was the one. So I made sure I was the first person on the list, went in, got the interview, and got the position. But I actually gravitated toward the substance abuse piece because I had no practice in substance abuse counseling. And it was something I really needed to plus up in, and I needed to make sure that it was a systemic focus. So I got very lucky to find a site where there was an LMFT who could help me with the systems approach if that was really what I was going for. But we may not always have that option. Hawaii is logistically on the short side of that stick. So I think one, when you're going into the interview or you're talking to a supervisor, remember it's just as much of you interviewing them as it is them interviewing you. Right. So have your questions prepared. Like, what approach do you use for supervision? What makes you use that approach? Right. Like if I came with this sort of case, how would you approach that case? How would you help me with that and supervise me on that so that you can really get an idea of like, what is it that I'm going to learn with this person? So really approaching that site or that person knowing you get to interview them as well. We kind of forget when we're the person seeking the job or the internship, right, or the supervisee, that we get to ask those questions too, right? We get to make sure that they're a good fit for us and that we're not just trying to get hours done. The other bit is, going back to this idea of, if you really want to get good at something, invest the time and the energy into it, even if you can't get it at your work site. I had to pay for all my, supervision for my LMFT hours privately. The systems I was in for work were not systemically focused. And so it was really great to have private supervisors who had that background and could help me navigate systems that weren't system focused, and be able to find little ways to get that approach in there with my clients and with my colleagues and with the system as a whole. So I, as much as private LMFT or other supervision can be an expense, I think that it can be a really sound investment if you really link up with, a person who can navigate you in that way.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Dr. Ball, how about you?
I don't like going last on this question because there's taking all of my good points. Catherine, I want to build on something you just said. I really like the word investment, because I think what happens a lot in my experience talking with students is that a lot of decisions are made out of convenience. And they see this application for licensure and I've got to meet all of these hours. And so supervision winds up being a box that they check, and they're just sort of going with whatever is, right there. And, we don't make those kind of decisions about, the restaurants we like. We go until we find a restaurant we love. Or the place that you get coffee, or, whatever it is that you want. Well, if you think about what supervision is intended to do, it's a huge part of your development as a professional. It's a huge part of who you're going to be with clients. This is an investment that you should be making from a very informed place. And so I really like what Catherine said as well about interviewing the interviewer, making sure that you come in prepared to ask questions about what will supervision look like? How do you conceive of cases? Asking those kind of questions. I think a lot of times what happens for folks is they get way too one down. And then it's just, I'm trying to show that I'm okay, please hire me, or please supervise me, and realizing that they might be shorting themselves because they didn't ask enough questions. And I really also like what Dr. Oliver was saying, use the network you've got. They know people who know people and might be able to put you in touch with somebody that really makes the difference in your own development. So take that time, make the investment.
I love that idea of it being, so foundation. In fact, that's what Motivo, I picked that name with intention because it means foundation in Portuguese, because I think of supervision as the foundational years of a therapist's practice. And one of the things I say sometimes is that I think free supervision comes with its own cost, like if you're just getting administrative supervision and it's just focused on your billable time and your productivity and your case notes, all good stuff, all important stuff. But if it's not helping you become, the clinician that you want to be, particularly from a family systems approach, there's other options available. One other just a quick suggestion I want to make, because I know some people might be like, I would love to pay for supervision. I can't, I'm barely making it as it is. I understand the reality of early career clinician and student loans and all of that. I think there's also an advocacy piece here that I wish I would have done more earlier in my career. I didn't even ask my site of, hey, there's only an LCSW here. Will you pay for me to have an LMFT? I've found one. Here's what the MFT approach is all about. Here's why I think it would be helpful to my clients and to the overall organization. Would you mind? I don't even think I asked. So just wanted to make that suggestion too, to advocate at your site for systemic supervision and see what they say. So next, I want to go to a slightly related issue. This question came up by several different people who were attending today's panel, and I wanted to take some time to talk about it. Some version of this question. Someone said, this last year revealed just how rampant anti-Blackness is among Americans, including therapists. How has the push for social justice in America impacted and or changed how they approach supervision? And particularly, that's a systemic thinking right there, even in and of itself. So, so Dr. Oliver, Dr. Addison, and Dr. Farrell all do work around social justice and multicultural counseling. So I want them to respond to that. And Dr. Oliver, we'll start with you.
I think that when it comes to supervisors, being intentional is to remain curious about the supervisees and the clients that they're seeing, and helping the supervisees to also be curious about their clients. A lot of the times, supervisees or maybe even supervisors are not comfortable asking certain questions, but I think that part of MFT allows us to remain curious, and we can be, sensitive to how we're framing our questions and our curiosities, but I think it's important that we put that at the forefront. Another thing when it comes to being culturally attuned, culturally sensitive, cultural, using cultural humility when it comes to our clients is that, with our supervisees, is for us to think of the questions that we have as a supervisor, that we are curious about the client, that perhaps we can discuss with the supervisee about how they can have those conversations with their client. I find that a lot of the times supervisees are not sure that they can do that. And if we give our supervisees that confidence to be able to ask those questions, that they can perhaps ask the questions that perhaps they are thinking about when it comes to the social justice or injustice that their clients might be experiencing in their communities. I think that sometimes people don't realize that even a clinician of color who is working with a client of color is not having that conversation. So how can we also have that conversation with people who are part of a community that they don't feel like they can have that conversation with someone who's also part of that community? And it's not just limited to race. It could be, anything that perhaps somebody is experiencing some level of cultural insensitivity or social injustice, that we can, as supervisors, help our supervisees to be advocates for their clients. And anybody who's not doing that work individually on their own, I think that perhaps they are a disservice to our field, because we are a systemic field, and it's important that we recognize that all of these different parts that are part of our system are going to be impacted. And we as the MFT fields can make a significant difference when people say, what is MFT? What is that? Why are you, who are you? I know about social work, I know about counseling. When they think about MFT, they can think about us being a field that is culturally attuned and recognizes social injustice within the community.
I love that. I love that. We're like the NBA of like the therapy field. Dr. Allison, how would you respond to that? Supervisors incorporating anti-racism in their systemic supervision.
Well, I think, Dr. Oliver, to follow on from what you just had to say there about the self of supervisor, self of therapist piece, and incorporating these difficult dialogues, I think that what just continues to become increasingly clear to me, or over and over, I am asked to recognize and acknowledge, is that as a white supervisor, when I come into the room, white supremacy comes with me, and I first and foremost have a responsibility to notice and acknowledge how I benefit from white supremacy, and how my ideas and my ways of thinking are often shaped by white supremacist ideas, and to dig those out and to be accountable for them as best as I can. For me, I think a really key piece of that is knowing how to broach difficult dialogues around race or gender or class or ability, et cetera, with my supervisees, and then model for them how to do that with their clients. This is something that I was taught how to do at Syracuse, but it really was given a kind of framework to think more critically about it, actually teaching over in the counseling field, to give counseling a little bit of view here. Norma Devine's ideas about broaching race and gender, about taking up those topics directly instead of kind of hedging around them or sort of hoping that the client might bring them up. She really makes the case for why it's important that we as therapists, and then also isomorphically as supervisors, I think, take on that responsibility ourselves. And so, I mean, I connect this to Ken Hardy's idea about the therapist being the broker of permission to have difficult dialogues, that if we just sit and wait for clients to tell us, I think there's a dynamic that you don't understand, Sheila, about how race is impacting me because you're a white person. That's almost never going to happen. And so I have to be differentiated enough, have to be able to self-soothe enough, and have done my work around my own racial privilege enough to say to a supervisor who is a Black person, or to help them say to their clients, I recognize that there's dynamics even between us that race and bias and racism is going to inform, and I want you to know that that's something that matters to me, and that is important. If that's something that you want to talk about, I'm here for that. And to take risks, to say things like, is it possible that part of what you're struggling with here, has something to do with your positionality in terms of race, has to do with the fact that you are a mixed race person and your client is a white person, or the fact that you are a white person and your client is Black, and how do you think you'll address that with them? And so modeling and even role playing some of these difficult dialogues to help folks kind of work through the anxiety and the training to not notice race, to not see color, to politely avoid bringing up these things in case it's painful for the client. All things that I've actually, of course, heard clinicians say are parts of my commitment to anti-racism that I'm insistent upon bringing up with my supervisees, and insistent on pushing them to develop those skills with their clients.
Yes, yes. Well said, Dr. Addison. Thank you. How about you, Dr. Farrell?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that was already discussed, that Dr. Oliver and Dr. Addison presented, and kind of building off of the latter. I believe that work, in helping our supervisees, helping our therapists, become more actively anti-racist starts with the supervisor. Right, kind of like how, Dr. Addison was saying, we have to do the work, whether you're Black, white, insert whatever background, to understand our intersecting identities, to understand our biases and our social location and how those are all related, so that we know how we're showing up in the room as supervisors. Because if we haven't done our own work first, we can't facilitate that for our supervisees. And so asking ourselves questions like how has race impacted my life? If I'm struggling to answer this question, why is that? What is most uncomfortable about talking about race? When did I first notice, that racism was a thing? And did my privilege or my identity have something to do with that? Did I just realize race was important last year? Or is it something that has been, part of my narrative? And how can I use all that to inform how I'm able to sit with, grace for myself as I learn what I need to unlearn, and then hold that space for my supervisees as well. But if we haven't done that work, then we won't be able to accomplish that. And a few tools that I've used both for myself and for my supervisees, the Becoming Anti-Racist, it's like a chart, and it has the different zones. They have like the fear, the learning, the growth, and it details what each zone looks like, and you can kind of assess and see where you're flowing and what you can do, to move towards, the growth zone, and also the moving walkway metaphor by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. It's essentially, there's a moving walkway, from the airport or malls or wherever, that's moving towards white supremacy. And it's our job to actively move in the opposite direction, right? If we're just standing still, we're not actively being racist or doing racist things. But if we're standing still, then we're still moving towards and contributing to white supremacy. So it's our job to do the work to turn around and move more quickly than the walkway is moving, so that we're going against the grain, right? And so just using some of these resources that are already out there to do the work for ourselves and recognize our own biases and our positionality in that regard will help be present in the room as we help our supervisees to do the work. And also when we fall short, seeking consultation as supervisors, right? Like, it's okay, like that's part of cultural humility. Cultural humility says I am taking ownership over my own education. I'm not going to put that on, insert whatever group of people, educate me. I'm taking ownership of this. And I know that it's a continual process of growth. It's not something that I arrive at. And I'm giving myself grace because I will make mistakes. There's going to be things I don't know. And what am I doing once that's brought to my attention? And so I feel like that work as a supervisor is what's paramount to being able to translate that into action in the supervisory context.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So well said. I'm going to also thank you for sharing those resources, Dr. Farrell, and I will put them in the follow-up email as well, so that you can make sure that you can look into those if you want to. I'm also going to just put here in chat to our Motivo peer groups. If you're not familiar with our peer groups, we have two on this topic in particular. One that is BIPOC consultation and support, led by Dr. Akinyela, for those identifying as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and therapists. And that meets every other week. It's completely free. And the other one is Examining White Privilege, and it's for white identifying individuals, led by Jean Combs and Jill Friedman, two incredible, if you don't know them, they're incredible narrative therapists, very well known in the field. And they lead the Examining White Privilege group every Saturday, also free. All of our peer groups are free, and they're here to be a resource for you. So let's get to our last question before we take some questions. I know we have some, so I want to make sure we get to those. So maybe let's try to be, since we're going to do all five of you guys, kind of brief 20 to 30 seconds of what is one practical tool that you can give to those listening today about how to do more systemic supervision. Maybe I shouldn't have said 20, 30 seconds. Take as long as you want, but maybe not more than a minute of a practical tool that you might recommend for people on how to incorporate more systemic approach in their supervision. So Dr. Ball, let's start with you.
Well, as a supervisor, one of the tools that I use is actually one that was given to me by a supervisor of mine, Fred Piercy, when I was in training at Purdue. And he always told me that systemic therapy is different than individual therapy, because individual therapy is client to therapist. Systemic therapy is client to client. And asking my supervisees, how much are you having the clients engage each other during your session? Rather than, I think a lot of beginning therapists have that anxiety that when the client is presenting the problem, I've got to solve it, I've got to fix it. And being able just to sit back and allow them to turn towards each other, because they're the ones that spend all their time together, not you and them, it's with them. And so that's something that's always stuck with me. Client to client is systemic therapy.
I love that. That's great. How about you, Dr. Addison?
Well, Dr. Ball, you kind of, I think, probably said what my first thought would have been as a Gottman method therapist, get folks into enactments. I think another piece that comes to mind is that I have sort of squirreled away an enormous library of video about people doing actual couple and family therapy. And sometimes that's access to video subscriptions now through my university's libraries. And sometimes it's actual videos that I've, picked up at sales from other therapists, or, deeply on sale at conferences. And I find that there's just almost no substitute for being able to watch people actually doing systemic therapy to really make it click for folks. Sometimes now that I've been recording myself for Gottman method therapy, when I have permission from clients, being able to share video of some of my own work can also be a piece of that. But it's really giving folks the chance to somehow watch, observe, or take in an actual systemic session that I think makes a huge difference.
I love that. I think that's so great. How about you, Dr. Oliver?
So I have two things. I do a genogram with every client of my own, and I do a genogram with every client of my supervisees. So I encourage my supervisees to do genograms, and similar to some of the conversation we've already had, it doesn't need to be this, professional genogram that has everything right, all of the depictions correctly. Just put something down so that when you come back to it, who these people are that you're talking about. Write notes in there that will help you to remember those specific details about that person that might be impacting the system. The other thing to consider is that for me, I always ask my supervisees, how are you looking at this systemically? It just helps them to think about it, it helps me to also think about that. So those are the two things. Hopefully my supervisors know that they need to be doing genograms, not because I'm grading them on it, but because it just is really helpful. But also, how are they thinking about it systemically? So when they have a presenting problem or an issue with the client that they feel like they are not really moving on, how are you looking at it systemically? And then also considering who in the system that they really haven't considered. You're talking about this couple, but you haven't talked about the mother-in-law who lives with them, something like that. Who are we not considering in the system that might be impacting the problem?
Thank you for that. How about you, Dr. Farrell?
Yeah, so something I always integrate into my supervision is the meta framework from IST or integrative systemic therapy, because it has different domains of the human experience, like spirituality and culture and development. And I prime my supervisees to look at the client and if there's any problems from those different lenses. And it also incorporates the different levels within the system. So like the individual, the dyad, the context, the family, larger societal system as well. And so using those concrete tools, I educate my supervisees about them, and then I integrate it throughout our supervision experience. And Doug Brennerlin, they since reformed it because they all got together and made it what it is today. But Doug Brennerlin came up with the meta framework for anyone who's curious.
Doug, can you say that again? Doug Brennerlin?
Yeah, Doug Brennerlin. I cannot spell it if I try.
I'll Google it. Thank you. How about you, Catherine?
Yeah, I lean in the direction of teaching to fish rather than give fish in my approaches. And so I know, one of my weaknesses as a supervisor is I can educate and I can teach really well, but success really lies in the supervisee learning the process. My best supervisors were the ones that helped me learn the process by which to make the multitude of decisions a therapist makes in any given session, right? Like as we move through the very minutes of a session, we're constantly sort of tuning in and sort of really being mindful of what am I going to say and ask next? What am I reading in the room? And there is a process by which a therapist really needs to learn that may not be standard protocol. So some of the questions I like to ask supervisees about their cases may be if you were to step back and talk to me about the interaction you see between the couple, what would you see? As a way of sort of shifting out of what we are really trained well in, which is the individual therapy model. When you pull back and see the big picture, tell me the steps in the stance with this couple, along with what are some ways that these folks are hitting the brakes in the escalation, and what are the ways that they're hitting the gas in this process? What are some other systems that may play here and influence? Because when we're sitting with a couple or a family or individual, we can easily forget that all sorts of other systems are in the room. Parenting, work, social relationships, extended family relationships, in addition to our internal systems, right? How we think, how we feel about things, our own sort of raw spots, if you will, with EFT language, the fight or flight activation, mental health concerns, all influence our inner world and show up in the between world of family members and individuals and couples. And so sort of shifting into then the supervisor-supervisee subsystem, I like to ask supervisees, how are you seeing this supervision process with me? What is this experience like for you? And what seems to be missing in our supervision process? Because I will have one perception of what that relationship looks like and feels like, right? And the impact, and my supervisee will have a different one. And this is a great way to sort of check in, under, some sort of routine of saying what are you getting and what are we missing, right? How has this experience been for you, to make sure that I'm tuning in better? And hopefully that transfers for them to do that with their clients as well, to sort of do that check-in process of working on that inner system between client and therapist. What's happening for you in this process?
Love that. That's a great way to end us out. Catherine, thank you for that. Let me just say a couple more things here. One, several people have asked in the Q&A about any of these supervisors who are taking on more supervisees. So I'm going to post to, this is the original registration page, and every supervisor who's on the panel today, their picture and their name links to their Motivo profile, and you can find them easily from that direction. Also, many of the supervisors on Motivo also do AAMFT supervision of supervision. And so if that's something that you are interested in, we can also help you with that and get you connected to any supervisor you'd like to meet. Unfortunately, we just err on the side of caution. We don't match anybody with a supervisor who's not licensed in their same state. So even though the rules are kind of here and there on that, we always put the same person with someone who's licensed in their state. They don't have to live there. So Catherine could supervise in Hawaii without living there because she's licensed there. So the other thing that I want to just offer is that we've gotten a lot of requests from a peer group perspective for modality specific peer groups. So I'll link to a survey on the email that I'll send out. And if you're interested in a peer group, again, our peer groups are free. That's just on narrative therapy for 4 to 6 weeks. We would love for you to be a part of that with us. And so 2 questions in here that I thought looked interesting from the Q&A perspective, and I'll just throw them out there for the panelists, and whoever wants to take it, feel free to. One of the questions is, how has supervision changed in the virtual environment for you? Another one around the idea of course, I'm just like stalling because I completely forgot it. So let's just throw that one out there. Any thoughts on supervision in the virtual world and how that maybe has changed?
I mean, one thing that I can say is without telehealth, I would not have been able to move from Oakland to Seattle and continue to supervise my 9 employees at my agency, Margin to Center in Oakland, or see my clients. So it's been a great boon. But I'll also say that everyone transitioning, you know, as rapidly and piecemeal as we kind of had to telehealth means that I've had a number of supervisees who for a long time we've kind of played the cat and mouse game of like, maybe you could video some sessions, and like, oh, I really would like to, but technology, or oh, I didn't turn the camera on, you know. And now here we are on Zoom or whatever kind of tool we use, and it's as simple as, if we have permission from clients, press a button and record. And so I've had more supervisees, you know, who have responded to the invitation of, what if you brought me some video? What if we sat and looked at moment-to-moment stuff in session? And all of them are so nervous about it who haven't done it in their degree programs. And it's wonderful to be able to encourage them and to show them, like, look at what you can accomplish if we look at just 2 minutes of video versus telling me about a case.
Love that, love that. Anybody else want to respond to that, supervision in the virtual world?
Yeah, I'll say, yeah, I teach at Wheaton College's MFT program, and I've been able to keep in contact with students who have actually gone international. So Motivo provides a platform. I've got a supervisee in China, in Singapore, and another former student who is moving to the Philippines. And so just the access that I've got for continuing the work that that was begun in the classroom as they're going out and beginning their training. I think it's great to have that access that I would otherwise not have had. So that's one definite positive of doing it via technology.
Love it. I love it. Well, I think that concludes us for today. We're almost getting to the end here, so I want to be conscious of everybody's time. Let me just quickly say, one other question was around AAMFT supervision, approved supervision. I think it's one of the best things that AAMFT does is their approved supervision. I went through the process. I learned so much. Just because you're a therapist doesn't mean that you know how to be a supervisor, is what I learned. Supervision is its own craft. It's its own thing. And I think they do an incredible job of giving supervisors what they need in order to be ready to supervise. So just plug for that. It's great. And I think it's a great learning experience. So Catherine, Dr. Ball, Dr. Oliver, Dr. Farrell, and Dr. Addison, thank you guys so much for taking time for this. You guys are lovely, wonderful humans. I'm so happy to know you, and I appreciate your time here today.